Hey folks, today I'm going to be doing an end of year reading wrap up of sorts by going through and ranking the last 66 books I've read in order from worst to best. As you can see, I've done away with the faceless approach for this video, and that is because I was not about to compile silly B-roll for 66 books. Before getting into things, I did want to provide a little bit of context on the ranking. It is based purely on my personal enjoyment, and I would say in highly generalized terms, I enjoy books that I think are entertaining, that I think are interesting, and that I feel have tastefully executed on whatever concept that the book might be going for. Commercially, I don't enjoy books that I think are boring, that I think are unintentionally stupid, and that give me the sense that they've been written either by scrubs or by total pretentious wankers. So higher ranked books, more of the attributes I enjoy. Lower ranked books, more of the attributes I don't enjoy. Now that I've managed to over-explain a book ranking video, let's just get into it. The worst book I read on this list is Indian Burial Ground by Medina. This is a commercial thriller horror book, and the reason why it is last on this list is I just think the writing in this is abominable. I made a dedicated video clowning on this book, and yeah, it is really just some of the worst writing I've ever read in a traditionally published book. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Songs for the Unraveling of the World by Evenson. This is a collection of horror short stories, and I was incredibly surprised to learn that the author here has a PhD in literature and is also a fairly decorated horror writer. I think this collection itself won a couple of awards, and I just don't get it. I think the writing in this is clumsy and ineffective. Some of the worst moments in this collection would be when they would go off on these like philosophical tangents that I thought were so inane and pointless. I'm going to read a quote here because I really think it sums up the reading experience. Interface. What an odd word, he told himself. Interface would be inside the face, within the face, which made sense, but interface would mean between the face. Like, this is how most of the stories would read to me. And yeah, I don't think this quote is meaningful. I don't think it's profound. I just think it's dumb as shit. The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This is another commercial thriller horror book. It's the first Paul Tremblay that I've read. And yeah, he's not for me. I didn't connect to the writing. I found it to be really corny and cringe, which that's not always a deal breaker for me, but I just feel like this book really wanted me to take it seriously, and I couldn't. Also, anytime an author uses a child as a device that is so transparently meant to create sappy and sentimental scenes, it puts the book on my shit list almost automatically, unless if there's like a lot of other things going for it, and in this case, there was not. Old God's Time by Sebastian. This is a literary mystery. It follows an older retired detective who appears to be going senile, and he is one day visited by a couple of his old colleagues. They want his help in solving a cold murder case, and we kind of get flashbacks into this guy's past, and we find out that he is actually inextricably tied to this case. The book is told with this murky stream of consciousness style, and it also features a ton of trauma. And yeah, I just thought it was unbearably pretentious. The story itself was not interesting enough to me to support this meandering, mushy plot, and so I found everything to be like offensively boring. On top of that, there is a specific event that happens in this book as part of a character's arc that I thought was totally out of the blue. It felt incredibly cheap and just in poor taste. So yeah, I did not appreciate this book. All Roads Lead Here by Mariana Zapata. This is a contemporary romance book. It features the single dad trope, and it's also supposedly a slow burn. Unfortunately, this one just like missed the mark for me completely. For romance books, I would say that I am primarily judging it based off of the interactions that the hero and heroine have with each other. If those aren't written in an interesting way to me, if there's not some other device used to build tension and chemistry, then the book fails as a romance book to me. And yeah, I just thought the interactions and dialogue between the two characters in this book were so bland. It was like corporate small talk level of bland to me. And I would also say the heroine in this is totally dumb as rocks. She at one point decides to go on this like expert level hike as an amateur hiker. She does this alone, and she endangers her life in the process, and I just think it is like total moronic behavior. Small Rain by Garth Greenwell. This is a contemporary lit fic book that features a queer relationship. It is about a man who gets suddenly diagnosed with this debilitating and life-threatening health condition, and he has to contend with an overburdened healthcare system, and we're kind of following him as he goes into this long-term hospital stay to receive treatment. It is supposed to be a slow-moving and meditative read, and it was just like punishingly dull to me. There's surprisingly very little emotion in the writing. I just would have thought there would have been more of an exploration of the main character's psyche, the inner turmoil that he's going through as part of this situation that he's found himself in. And yeah, there just wasn't much of that. And instead, there was just pages and pages and pages of medical and hospital related minutia, which thanks to this book, I now know I hate reading about. What Moves the Dead by Kingfisher. This is a retelling of the fall Fall of the House of Usher. And it's the first T. Kingfisher book that I've read. This author seems to have exploded in popularity over the last several years. I would say I definitely made a critical mistake in reading this almost directly after reading the original short story by Edgar Allan Poe. And I would say the difference in the quality of prose and storytelling was just so jarring. I just didn't connect to the writing here. I thought it was really clunky and ham-fisted, and it doesn't come close to creating the oppressive atmosphere and mood that is so intrinsic to the original short story. It seems the author was really concerned with adding what I found to be extremely pointless exposition and backgrounds for the characters, which I was not interested in reading about. And I will also say I personally found the non-binary gender rep in this to be like pretty questionable. It felt totally shoehorned in, completely tokenized. Like you literally could have ripped out those pages of this book and it would have zero bearing on the actual story. So yeah, I was not a fan of this. The Love of My Life by Rosie Walsh. I picked this up because at one point it was a Good Morning America book club pick. This is a commercial thriller mystery. It also kind of has like a love story at its center. The premise is very like Gone Girl style. A husband's wife goes missing very suddenly and he uncovers a bunch of mysteries about her past. This is like totally just like a popcorn airport read. It very much gives like trashy, melodramatic Lifetime movie vibes, and it has like pretty bottom of the barrel writing to go with it. There's zero semblance of realism. There's an overuse of exclamation points in the dialogue that I found to be incredibly distracting. The twists are like really outlandish and dumb, but not like so outlandish that they become like the fun kind of trashy. I don't think it's the case here where it's like it's so bad it's good. It's very much like mediocre trash, which I feel like is one of the worst things a book can be. Mexican Gothic by Silvia moreno-garcia. This is a really disappointing read to me because it seems to be like such a popular and beloved book. It is a Gothic family drama. I think it's set in like the 1950s. It is about a young woman who is a wealthy socialite. At the beginning of the book, she receives a letter from her married cousin, and her cousin seems to be in a very deranged state of mind. She's talking about like mysterious things happening in her house. So Noemi ends up visiting her cousin to try to get to the bottom of like whatever's happening there. This book draws a lot of comparisons to Rebecca, which I honestly think is super disrespectful to Daphne du Maurier. I don't think those books exist in the same universe, let alone the same level. The writing felt super flat to me here. It has a lot of clunky exposition. I don't think there's any real sense of suspense or atmosphere created by the writing. And I would say when it comes to the plot, like nothing happens for the first 2/3 of the book, and then the last 1/3 devolves into this completely absurd, like supernatural soap opera. So I don't even think the pacing made for a propulsive, like popcorn read. So yeah, I don't really think there was anything worthwhile that this book had to offer. The Wasp Factory by Iain Banks. This is like a short psychological thriller book published in the 80s. It is under 200 pages, but it feels 20 times longer when you're reading it. And yeah, it just didn't grab me overall. You're basically following a boy. I think he's in his teens or something, and he is a psychopath. He likes to spend his time torturing animals, making pipe bombs. He does strange pagan ritualistic shit. He's talking to you about like the people that he's killed in the past. And so you're reading about all this disturbing stuff, and we're also hit with these hints that tease us about a secret that his father is keeping from him. I think this like mix of things is supposed to make for a compelling and gripping read, but it wasn't that for me. It just felt flat and repetitive. And even when we got to like the final climactic reveal, I was just very much underwhelmed. Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder. This is contemporary lit fic. It is part of the unhinged woman, female rage subgenre. The premise is a woman who is a new mother. She finds herself turning into a dog at night, which is an interesting concept, but I just am not convinced that this should have been anything more than a 50-page short story. And this idea, when it gets stretched out to 250 pages in the hands of this author, became an insufferable word-vomited rant on all of the buzzy feminist themes, the patriarchy, new motherhood, gender roles, but honestly, none of this was explored in a way that I thought was interesting or compelling. It just felt super stale. What Does It Feel Like by Sophie Kinsella. This author, I would say, is like a pretty legendary British chick lit writer, and this is a short semi-autobiographical account of her being diagnosed with a really aggressive form of brain cancer and also her undergoing treatment for that. Yeah, I'm sure her actual real life journey was super inspiring and compelling, but her account of it was unfortunately super forgettable to me. So yeah, I'm sorry to say that this did not really leave an impression on me, hence why it ranks so low. 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. This is a contemporary second chance romance book. It is about two people who fall in love in high school over the span of 7 days. They get separated. Both of them ultimately wind up becoming really successful authors who have been writing to each other through their characters in their books. So yeah, interesting premise to me, but I just did not care for the execution. I would say I think where this author's writing shines is when she tries to go for really zany and wacky humor. There were some funny moments in this book to me, but where I don't think this author's writing shines is when she's trying to build chemistry between characters. And that is primarily what I'm reading a romance book for. I thought there was a lot left on the table when it came to the premise. The dialogue in a lot of scenes was pretty cringe to me too. I will also say I think it takes a really skilled writer to balance tragedy and humor. And there was an attempt made here because there's like a bunch of trauma in these characters' past that gets unpacked. But I don't think those scenes elicited the emotional reaction that they wanted to out of me. Belladonna by Adalyn Grace. This is a young adult gothic romantasy. I did do a separate review of this. And yeah, I think it's just like pretty middle of the road romantasy. It is about a girl who is immortal. She has a relationship with Death, who is personified as a character here, and she has to like solve this mystery related to someone who's poisoning her cousin. The writing isn't totally offensive to me, but the main issue I have with this book is it just tries to do way too much, which I think is like a stylistic choice nowadays in young adult, because it's like, why would you need to explore anything with any real depth or skill when you could just like smash every single plot device and trope that exists into a book to fill the pages? And so that's kind of what this read like to me. There is a coming of age story, there's a love triangle, family drama, a thriller mystery situation. Oh, one last thing I'll say on this is definitely I think the heroine of this book is like on the dumber side of things, which is totally fine because it's just a fun, silly story. Literally there is zero need to think too hard about this one like I'm doing right now. Horrorstor by Grady Hendrix. This is a comedy horror book. It takes place in a haunted IKEA. It's kind of like a parody on consumerism and retail work culture. This book is like totally goofy and camp. It is not at all meant to be taken seriously. Like the plot goes completely off the rails. And ultimately, I just found myself not being a huge fan of this type of humor and style. It just reads as like super smarmy and grating to me. I really very badly wanted all the characters in this book to just die horrible deaths, which I don't even get the satisfaction of, unfortunately. There definitely is entertainment value here for me, especially in seeing how individual plot points in this book would like outdo each other in their sheer stupidity. Like there is this one setup for a scene that hinges on a character just very randomly pulling out 8 handcuffs from his backpack. And it's so ridiculous and absurd. And I honestly would just read this book for that moment alone because it made my brain explode. Claimed by the Horde King by Zoey Draven. This is a self-published alien romance that is pretty beloved on the fantasy romance subreddit. It is about a lonely outcast woman on this alien planet. She gets taken in by this alien king and they fall in love and they smash. I was actually pleasantly surprised by the writing in this book. I think it's decent and above average for the genre. I like the initial scene where the hero and heroine met. That was actually a memorable moment to me. But yeah, that's probably the only thing I remember from this book. I think I just lost interest as the story progressed. I do think there is like this stupid third act breakup, which is kind of like par for the course with these types of books. I think the heroine in this book definitely has more brain cells than the heroine in both Belladonna and the Mariana Zapata book. Right, by Sarah Rose Etter. This is contemporary sad girl lit fic. It is a parody of capitalism as well as corporate work culture. The protagonist we're following is a woman who works in a high-paying tech job, and she has to grapple with a demanding job as well as being really depressed and disillusioned. I think the best parts of this book are when it's trying to be goofy. There are some funny scenes in this depicting hustle culture as well as some of these superficial interactions we have with our colleagues. But unfortunately, this book did not work for me on an emotional level. I just found the depiction of the protagonist's depressive state to be so overwrought. There is a specific black hole metaphor that is used to describe her depression, and it is so overdone and repetitive. I think it appears every other freaking page, and I will probably remember this metaphor for the rest of my life, which is something that I'm kind of mad about. The Will of the Many by James Islington. This is Roman-inspired epic fantasy. The entire plot of this book is about a boy who is a lost prince from a conquered nation. He infiltrates a military political school and makes a bunch of friends, has to compete in the school competition. He's also tasked with like solving this like mystery, and he has to grapple with a bunch of political agendas from different powerful people. And at the very end of the book, he discovers this mind-bending secret. This book has been praised to high heavens by literally everyone and their moms, and I just think it's like super boilerplate stuff, which maybe that's why everyone likes it. Literally pick any single fantasy trope that you like and it's probably found in this book. I think there's a good amount of twists and turns in the plot that should make for a compelling read. This basically reads like a novelization of a shonen anime. And yeah, I wasn't the biggest fan of this. It comes down to the writing, which while I think there are nice moments, it mostly comes across as incredibly dull and unimaginative. It holds the reader's hand way too much. And so in that way, it reads like young adult fantasy. The characters were uninteresting to me. Also, the way the school setting is written, it is so underutilized. Like, does this author use the school to expand the world? No. Is it used to highlight interesting character dynamics? No, I don't think so. It's mainly used as a vehicle for this stupid school competition that creates like artificial stakes that isn't even like crucial to the plot of the story. And yeah, this book is so bloated in length and it's just not for me. I will not be continuing on in the series. The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. This one I'm kind of sad about because it is such a beloved young adult fantasy book. It is about seemingly the last unicorn on Earth, and she goes on a journey to find others in her species, and along the way she meets this like colorful cast of characters. I do think this delivers on like the premise and conceit of the book. It is a very whimsical fairy tale. It's complete with a ton of mythical creatures. There's prince and princesses, you got your wizard, there's magic and riddles. And I think the writing is totally fitting for this kind of story. It has this like archaic and poetic feel to it. I think it's a case of wrong book, wrong time, because I was reading this and I just wasn't interested in anything about it. One of the big takeaways for me from this reading experience is I now know that songs and riddles in books annoy the absolute shit out of me, and there is no shortage of that in here. And anytime we would come to another song or riddle in the story, it would cause me like physical pain not to skim over them. So yeah, unfortunately not a book that worked for me, but I can appreciate why others would like it. The Book of George by Kate Greathead. This is contemporary lit fic. It is a coming of age story about a guy named George who is a fairly privileged white guy, and we kind of just follow him from his preteens all the way up till he's like 40 years old, and we watch how he becomes like this dysfunctional guy who lives a life of mediocrity. I think the idea of this is this author knew guys like George in her life, the kind of guy who is wishy-washy, kind of underperforms his potential, and she wanted to conceptualize a story and character history for this type of guy in her life. A large portion of this book details an on and off relationship that George has with a woman, and we just watch how he like fumbles this relationship. I will say I was expecting a bit more humor in the writing because all the reviews I was reading of this book going in were praising it for being like super funny and witty and clever, and I just didn't pick up on that in the writing. I honestly found this mostly mundane and boring. I will say though, I was interested to know like how this pathetic George character would end up at the end of the book, but now having gone on this journey, I can just say it was like kind of a mid experience. The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. I did a dedicated review of this book. It is my first Brandon Sanderson read, and it's just not for me. Cool magic system on paper, but when Sanderson tries to write about said magic system, it comes across as the blandest of bland to me. He over-explains in ways that are distracting, and so all of this in combination makes me lose almost all appreciation for the ideas and concepts that he tries to convey. Such Small Hands by Andre Barba. This is a short translated piece of literary horror. It is 100 pages or so of little kids acting really creepy and weird. The premise is a new girl arrives at an orphanage, and the rest of the little girls in this orphanage soon become incredibly obsessed with the new girl. They all play this weird game where each day one girl pretends to be like a lifeless doll, and things start to get really surreal. I think this is fine for what it is. It's well written if you want like a weird little read. It just didn't really leave much of an impression on me. Invisible Monsters by Chuck Palahniuk. This is the first book I've read from this author who also wrote Fight Club, and I'll probably give him another try, but I wasn't the biggest fan of this one. This is a satirical psychological thriller that was just overall a mixed bag for me. The protagonist we're following is a model who at the beginning of the book gets shot in the face, and as she's recovering in the hospital, she meets this trans woman, and they kind of go on this road trip together and start conning people. It is a very distinct flavor of book. It is totally over the top, really in your face, very camp. There's a lot of disturbing content. None of the characters are meant to be likable. It's told in this like non-linear timeline, and we would constantly be jumping around to different parts in the timeline. And the way the author would write this would be, he would literally write jump to a time when, jump to a scene that. This shtick was so annoying and grating to me rather than interesting. I will say there were funny scenes in this to me, and some of the twists in the story were genuinely shocking to me, but I would say like all in all, not totally jazzed about this read. The Unseen World by Liz Moore. This is a book club style literary novel. It is part mystery, part coming of age story. The main character is a girl who's been raised by a very eccentric professor father, and she's kind of been socially isolated from people her own age throughout her childhood. She, at the beginning of the book, has just started high school, I think, and one day her father just up and vanishes. There's been clues related to his disappearance left on this like AI software that this character has been building with her father, and as she tries to figure out where her father's gone, she uncovers secrets about his past. Thematically, this touches on a lot. You have the coming of age story, the awkwardness of childhood, you got the aging parents, there's also like socio-political stuff that it touches on. I do think the writing is fine. I just think it takes way too long to get to the point. Some of the characterization was really unconvincing to me, like the way the father is depicted, he becomes a complete caricature of a person. It became really goofy to me. me. I will say the one thing I did appreciate was I liked the way that this author depicted some of these social dynamics of high school. I thought some of those scenes were really moving, but the rest of it I would say is forgettable to me. Rules of Civility by Amor Tolls. This is a historical novel that is set in I think like 1930s or 1950s in New York City. It is about two working class women who are best friends and roommates, and they one day befriend this seemingly really wealthy man at a bar, and it's kind of just about all the drama that ensues within this friend circle. I liked how some of the petty jealousies within female friendship was depicted in this book. I also thought there were some pretty juicy reveals that happened, but unfortunately the pacing to get to some of these reveals I thought was abysmal. There's some pretty transparently sentimental stuff in here, and I would also say I wasn't the biggest fan of the characterization of the heroine. I had like no real sense of what her personality was like reading through this book. I'm not really mad at this one. It's just kind of like a whatever read to me. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carre. This is probably the most disappointing read for me on this list, and the reason why is because I read The Spy Who Came in from the Cold from the same author, and I absolutely love that book. It is stone cold S tier to me, but this was just so not that. This is a classic Cold War spy novel that was written in the 50s. The main character is George Smiley, and he is a retired British intelligence officer who ends up getting roped back in by top brass within the spy organization, which is called the Circus, and he is tasked with rooting out a mole in the circus. The skeleton of this plot is super simple. It is really two things. It is George Smiley getting a debriefing on how they know that there's a mole in the organization, and then it is George Smiley going about trying to triangulate to who that mole is. And the way that this plays out on paper is so mind-numbingly dull. There are some tension-filled moments in this book, but for the most part, it's tons of people having conversations about past events. It's people reading files about past events. Tons of characters are introduced. There's mountains of exposition. There's lots of wading through details of the bureaucracy within the circus. And all of this is done in order to piece together this like chain of events and realizations that would lead you to conclude who the mole is. And it's just almost too subtle for its own good, because I found this really hard to follow at times, and so it was hard to be invested because of that. Like at one point, the chain of events is one where George Smiley talks to person A, then talks to person B, then talks to person C. But person C could have given him the same information as person A and B, and there was no reason why he needed to talk to person C last in that sequence of events. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I was just so disappointed in this. I would also say there's probably like a lot of subtext related to the historical and political environment at the time this was written, but I just could not be bothered about any of that. The Lines of Alersant by Guy Gavriel Kay. This is the first book I've read by this author, who is a widely praised fantasy writer. This is fairly low fantasy and it reads more like historical fiction, and I definitely appreciate like what it's going for. I think this will scratch that historical, epic, sweeping, high stakes political intrigue type of story for a lot of people. At a high level, it has like a medieval setting. You're following a couple of different characters, and it's basically about a couple of warring nations that are vying for power. And I think it's like an allegory for some of the history between the three like major religions. I don't know much about that. I definitely think it has its fun and exciting moments, but I definitely would have had more fun if I went in like expecting a historical K-drama type of experience, which I feel like is exactly what this read like. It is so over the top and melodramatic. There's zero subtlety to the writing. So it has its fair share of like eye-roll inducing moments to me, especially when it came to like some of the banter and just some of like the overall writing elements that felt kind of trite to me. There's this one scene that really sticks out in my mind. It's when the two main male characters meet for the first time and they make eye contact. The way this scene is described, it basically, I kid you not, it dedicates like 3 entire pages to describing the significance and meaning behind like this eye contact that is made between these two characters, and it's just so goofy. This is the exact moment in a K-drama where there would be 40 different camera angles zooming around the main characters, and the soundtrack would literally get volumed up to the max. So yeah, like I think this has its fun moments. I didn't like love this, and I was honestly a little bit disappointed just based on all of the hype around this author, but I would give another one of his books a go. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. This is an American classic. It is an anti-war novel, and it's basically one big entire joke about the military, inept bureaucracy, and like capitalism and war. This is probably like a pretty blasphemous ranking, but it is by far the most frustrating book I have ever read in my entire life. Like I wanted to commit physical violence violence against this book. There are a handful of scenes in this book that are like gold nuggets to me. They are so hysterically funny and clever, but then the rest of this book, like 90% of it, is filled with the most infuriatingly stupid digressions, pages and pages of inconsequential details, like silly circular dialogue. And I get that's like supposed to be the point. Like, you're supposed to be frustrated. It's supposed to be nonsensical. It is supposed to mirror the experience of this character who's caught in this catch-22, but it just was so obnoxious to me. It was beaten like a dead horse. And so when actual tragic stuff started to happen and people started to die, I just was like so whatever about it. This is going to be a spoiler because I just have to talk about one of my favorite scenes in this book. So basically, we have one character in this book who is a pilot, and he really enjoys like annoying and scaring people on the ground when he's flying. And the way he'll do this is he will basically nosedive his plane to get as close to the ground as possible before, like, you know, swooping back up. So he's doing this all the time to the characters in this book. And there's this one scene where he does this trick again, miscalculates, gets way too close to the ground, and flies through his friend. Like, his friend gets completely shredded on the plane's propeller, and he dies. And the guy in the plane is obviously distraught, and he commits suicide by flying himself into the mountain. I think this is supposed to be an incredibly tragic and emotional scene, but all I could think about during it was good fucking riddance. Snaring the Huntress by Sylvia Day. Look, I'm not directly saying that this 25-page alien erotica has more literary value than all the novels that I've previously mentioned on this list, but I'm also not saying that. Honestly though, I unironically thought that this was delightful. It is totally goofy and camp, but also like kind of hot, which I don't know about you, but that's kind of all I'm asking for in my alien erotica. Next, I'm going to be talking about two contemporary romance books that are basically interchangeable in terms of their ranking. One of them has a single dad trope. The other one is Friends to Lovers. They're both by Sarah Mayberry, who is mostly a Harlequin romance writer, but I honestly think she is so slept on. I just remember having a really great time with these books. They're exactly my brand of contemporary romance. They're the perfect palate cleansers. They have tight, focused narratives. They're under 300 pages. It's nothing too flashy. They're unproblematic, really solid chemistry and emotion in the writing, and they have hot smut scenes. They're honestly the back to basics kind of romance books, which if you can deliver well, I will eat up probably every single time. Silk by Alessandra Barrico. This is a short little historical novella. I think it is translated from Italian. At the center of it is a love story. It is kind of a slower moving read. A lot of it is about longing. It is set during World War II. It is about a man who works in a silk factory, and he is tasked with importing silkworms from Japan, and so he's constantly making these trips there. On one of these trips, he falls in love at first sight with a concubine of a nobleman that he meets in Japan. And a lot of the story is about his unconsummated love and obsession with this woman, but it also touches on some of the things that he misses out on in life because of this obsession. And I just thought the story gives a really nice snapshot into a specific time period and setting. I enjoyed the direction that the story took, and I thought the ending was great. It's nothing like knock your socks off, but I did think it was a solid read and well executed. The English to Understand Wool by Helen DeWitt. This is a short novella that is a parody and critique on the wealthy and elite, as well as aspects of the publishing industry. The main character is a girl who comes from a really rich family, and for the first half of the book, we're kind of just following her as she lives her rich girl life. And then there is a twist that takes place in kind of the middle of the story that I thought was really great. The writing here is very quirky and tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of like intentionally overindulgent. It has a certain charm to it to me, and overall I found this to be a really breezy read that was worth a few chuckles. The Hypocrite by Jo Hamya. This is probably one of the artsier contemporary lit fic books on this list, so be warned, there is a fair amount of pretension in this book. It's basically about a dysfunctional father-daughter relationship. The daughter is a playwright, and she ends up writing a play that totally like clowns on her dad and makes him out to be like a total sleazeball. We get flashbacks into the past that kind of detail why this daughter has like a grudge against her dad, and we also get to see her dad's reaction to the play like in real time without having any prior context. And so a lot of this book is seeing like these two characters traumatize each other. I think we're supposed to sympathize with both characters like equally and think that they're both in the wrong. Honestly, I was more on the dad's side. I thought he had the moral high ground. Like, I feel like we're just watching elder abuse because her dad gets like totally emotionally wrecked by this play. It also does like the literary meandering thing, which I was less interested in, but overall I really enjoyed the conceit of the story. I wanted to know how it wrapped up. I'd also say that there are some pretty meta aspects to this book that I appreciated, and I thought the ending was fantastic. All Fours by Mariana July. This book has ended up on a lot of the best books of 2024 lists, and I feel like this book is one of the most like concentrated forms of LA millennial culture I've ever read. It features the unhinged woman trope, and the main character is a woman who is married and has a kid, and she decides to embark on a solo road trip one day, doesn't even manage to make it 20 miles in, and instead spends the duration of the trip in a hotel room that she decides to renovate. And she ends up having an affair with the husband of the interior designer that she hires to help with this like renovation project. It hits on female desire, friendship, motherhood, marriage, aging. I did really enjoy the writing style. It is a very zany and quippy flavor, but there's also some poetic moments. I definitely think it tries really hard to be funny, and a lot of the humor worked for me. I thought there were some really hilariously memorable scenes in this. It definitely gets like out there. There's a scene involving urine that I'm sure would be a turnoff for a lot of people. I would also say like I didn't really care for the main character's arc. Like she just came off as whiny and entitled, and so was insufferable to me. But I did like the writing style and the tone of the book, and it's probably one of the more entertaining modern feminist literature types of books that I've read. Anne of Avonlea by L.M. Montgomery. This is the second book in the Anne of Green Gables series, and it is just a great, fluffy, feel-good, lighthearted read that I think is well written. I will say I do have to be in like the right mood for this kind of like cloyingly sweet and twee book, but for what it is, I think it hits those notes perfectly. The Stranger by Albert Camus. This is a French classic. It is a short, absurd read. It is about a man who is completely emotionally detached from everything in his life, and he finds himself committing a completely random and senseless act of murder that he then gets put on trial for and ultimately convicted. A lot of this book is the main character being just like a complete sociopath as he moves through the daily motions of life and his relationships, and you get to see some funny contrast in this guy's inner monologue, which is totally robotic and divorced from like anything that is a reasonable emotional reaction to anything. It does get a little dry at times for me, but I would say once he commits the murder and gets put on trial, it became a really gripping read to me. It's a classic. There's probably a lot of subtext that went over my head, but I would say if you're a fan of absurd, depressing, nihilistic fiction, then I definitely think this is worth reading. A Meal in Winter by Hubert Mingarelli. This is a historical novella that is translated from French, and it takes place during World War II and is about 3 Nazi soldiers and friends who are stationed in this concentration camp in Poland. They have the opportunity one day to shirk their execution responsibilities at the camp by going out and searching these surrounding areas for Jews that might be in hiding. They actually end up finding a Jew, and they stay overnight in this cabin and have a meal together. Thematically, it really delves into normal people grappling with the morality of war. I think it does a great job evoking a sense of time and place, and there's some really great interactions between the 3 friends and soldiers. I would say I didn't really care for some of the more like sentimental scenes, but overall I thought this was a nice melancholic story. Matrix by Lauren Groff. This is a historical lit fic book. It takes place in medieval Europe, and it follows a noblewoman who I think is actually based on a real historical figure, but she at the beginning of the book gets banished to this abbey that is completely destitute, and we kind of follow her throughout her life as she amasses great power and wealth at this abbey. It is a very feminist story about female ambition. It's very character driven. I really love the writing in this. It is lyrical and lush, but also has this very irreverent sense of humor, which I appreciated. There's nothing about it that really stands out to me, but I would say it was just like a constant level of engagement from me throughout the book, and I just think it was a fairly well-crafted story. I will be reading more from Lauren Groff. Figures in a Landscape by Barry England. This is a pulpy military survival story that I think was written in the 60s. It was actually nominated for the inaugural Booker Prize. I want to say this takes place during like the Iraq War. It follows 2 prisoners of war at the beginning of the book who escape their bonds and try to make their way to freedom through a jungle while being chased by their enemies. There's definitely language in here that for sure ages this book, but I would say there's sections of this that I thought were incredibly gripping. There's one specific action scene that I thought was amazing and definitely sticks out in my memory. The villains also had a standout presence, and there are really cool ways in which this like cat and mouse strategic game plays out. I really enjoyed the friendship and dynamic between the 2 main characters. I thought it was very much earned, and overall found the ending to be really fitting for this kind of story. I will say, and this is like a me problem, that there definitely is a lot of care taken to describing the setting, the jungle, the topography and terrain, and some of those scenes, it's actually important to be able to visualize the setting because the characters make strategic decisions to better position themselves in relation to like the terrain. Some of them I just wasn't able to picture in my mind, so I think that probably took away a little bit from the experience, but I mean overall it was still a really entertaining read. The Book of Elsewhere by Keanu Reeves and China Mayville. I did a separate review of this one. It is probably one of the more experimental books on this list. It is broadly speculative fiction, but it definitely dips its toe into a number of different genres. It is based on a comic book series, and so there are a lot of goofy and pulpy plot lines in this. The main character is an immortal warrior who is tens of thousands of years old, and it's kind of just about his life and his relationships. It's him grappling with his immortality, and then he's also going up against this like shadowy secretive organization that I think is trying to harness his power of immortality. It is stylistically very distinct, and it's definitely not going to be everyone's cup of tea. The prose in some sections is fairly dense, but I personally thought there were a lot of beautiful and evocative moments in the writing, and I thought the sci-fi elements in the story were really cool. It doesn't like fully come together for me because some parts of it get like a little bit incoherent, but overall it was an enjoyable read that I thought was fairly unique. The Melting by Liz Spitt. I also did a separate review of this one. It is a literary thriller that was originally published in Dutch. I picked this up because I just get the itch sometimes to read something really effed up and depressing, and this definitely fits the bill. It is an incredibly disturbing story. We're basically following a girl who has a really, really traumatizing childhood, and she is out to get revenge on a couple of specific people in her past. It does end up feeling a bit long for what it is, and it definitely can be overwritten at times to me, but there were some really vividly gruesome and disgusting scenes in this book that really got under my skin. The climactic scene was one in particular that I thought was incredibly shocking. This book does feature a riddle that, if you are familiar with, it might kind of ruin the ending for you, but I personally did not know about this riddle, and so I was genuinely shocked by the ending, and I personally really liked it. Okay, now I'm going to talk about 3 nonfiction books in this list that I all thought were great, really interesting, and worthwhile reads. Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is about a period in Irish history known as the Troubles, and it's specifically delving into a particular sect within the Irish Republican Army. I thought it lays out in fairly detailed but digestible ways these pretty complex socio-political and ethnic tensions within this period of time in this area, and you get a sense of like how people quote-unquote become radicalized during this time period and take up violence as a means for change. Also, one of the most wild things to me about this book was learning about the person Gerry Adams and the fact that this guy was a high-ranking member of the Irish Republican Army, had direct discretion and authority over bombings and civilian killings, and he ends up becoming a politician later in life, and then starts like flat out denying his involvement with the IRA as part of his political agenda. It is just some crazy gaslighting. And yeah, this guy is like still alive today. Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. Again, great nonfiction as far as I'm concerned. Compelling, educational, really gripping narrative. I did have like an inkling in my mind about the atrocities committed against Indigenous people as part of America's history, but it's still so crazy reading about some of the history in this book. Like the fact that there was an entire cottage industry dedicated to swindling Indigenous people out of their money is so wild and disgusting to me, but yeah, made for a really interesting read. Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19 by Matt Ridley and Alina Chan. This book provides a fairly detailed breakdown of key arguments for both the lab leak theory as well as the natural origin hypothesis of COVID-19. A quick note about this one, I would suggest doing maybe a little bit more primary research on the authors of this book than I myself did. It's generally like a compilation exercise for them, so I think it's like generally fine. From my perspective, I just thought it was a really juicy read. A lot of this book is piecing together all these discoveries that these Twitter sleuths made, and it talks through all these conflicting interests among key parties that actually prevented a thorough investigation into the origin of COVID in the first place. At the very end, they kind of say that there's no smoking gun as it relates to either theory, but I do think just based on this book, it is clear that the lab leak hypothesis was prematurely suppressed in the public's mind at the very beginning of this pandemic. And yeah, I just thought this was a super awesome read. The Hunter by Richard Stark. This is a pulp noir novel. The main character is a criminal who is out to get revenge on an old associate of his who had double-crossed him in a prior heist. The protagonist is definitely an anti-hero, and he has some pretty detestable qualities. He has no moral compass. He is not above brutally murdering people who get in his way. He's very single-track minded, but he's also super competent and efficient at what he does. I really love this character archetype. I found him incredibly easy to root for. And overall, I just think this is really well-executed pulp noir. The writing is sharp. I think it's well-paced. The story is gripping. Some of the dialogue was pretty funny. It's a slim little novel, but overall great fun. Offshore by Penelope Fitzgerald. I believe this was a Booker Prize winner in the 90s, and yeah, I thought this was really good. It is 200 pages or so, but there's a ton packed into this. It's about a community of people who live on riverboats in the Thames. It's got kind of an ensemble cast of characters, and we just get little snippets of their lives and their relationships. Thematically, it is taking a look at what it's like to live on kind of like the fringes of society. Apparently, this author actually spent time living on the Thames, and I think you can absolutely tell with just the amount of detail and care she takes in bringing the setting to life. It's really transportive, and I would say like stylistically, her writing is fairly simple, unadorned, but it is so precise. I think she draws like really memorable and distinct characters with, again, very little page count, and overall I just thought this was really well done. Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. This is a German classic and some of my favorite absurd fiction. It is about a man who one day wakes up and finds himself transformed into a bug, and basically his entire life falls apart because of it. I don't really have much to add to the conversation around this book. It is written in a way that I found to be incredibly compelling. It's allegorical, it's got symbolism and deep meaning and shit. I'm not like smart enough to articulate some of the nuances of all of it, but just know it's in there. The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. This is probably the first Edgar Allan Poe story that I've officially read like outside of high school. And yeah, this is great. Some of the best atmospheric writing. The man is a legend for a reason. The Trial of Anna Thalberg by Eduardo San Garcia. This is a short read translated from Spanish. It is historical lific and is about the evils of religious institutions. I want to say it's like set during medieval times, during this witch hysteria period. One of the characters gets accused of being a witch, and she ends up getting imprisoned and tortured by the church. I really enjoy the writing. It is incredibly incredibly poetic and sensory. I thought it made for a really immersive reading experience. I will also say that the villain in this book is one of the most evil characters I've ever read, and he totally gets owned in the end, which was incredibly satisfying. The Factory by Hiroko Oyamada. I did a separate review of this. It is a novella that is translated from Japanese. It is absurd, surreal fiction that is a critique of capitalist corporate work culture in Japan, and it follows these three people who work in this very exaggerated company called The Factory. And yeah, I just really enjoyed the absurd aspects of the story. I thought they were creative, and I would say it really captures this sense of like corporate malaise and disillusionment well. Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. This is a collection of 4 short stories, the longest one being Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is the story that the movie is based off of. And I don't think you can go wrong with any of the stories in this collection. I think Truman Capote is an amazing writer and storyteller. There is a melancholic quality that kind of runs through each of these stories, and they were all just surprisingly complex and affecting to me. Not to be like a total pretentious snob, but these just read like stories to me that are written by a professional writer who works really hard at his craft. Good stuff, in my opinion. The October Country by Ray Bradbury. This is a collection of like gothic pulp horror short stories, and I think Ray Bradbury is praised for a reason. I wasn't really disappointed by a single story in this collection. They are imaginative, they're eerie, just a masterclass in the show not tell, in my opinion. The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. This is a 30-page short story that I would classify as like historical fantasy. It is about a female knight that keeps getting reincarnated, and she seems to be destined to continue to sacrifice her life for one specific cause. This is such a punchy story, but I thought it was beautifully told, and I just love the way it plays out. I would go so far as to say that it is one of my favorite love stories of all time. Farewell Earth's Bliss by D.G. Compton. This is a short classic sci-fi novel that I think was published in the 50s, and it is exploring the worst aspects of society through a penal colony on Mars. At the beginning of the book, we are following a new shipment of criminals to this penal colony. This is an incredibly bleak book. It's only 150 pages or so, but I think it has like incredible economy of world building. There's so many interesting aspects to how the social structure is organized in this colony. I think there's really distinct characters and a really memorable ending. Just great stuff to me overall. Black Water by Joyce Carol Oates. This is my first time reading this author. I would classify this as like sad girl lit fic. It is a novella that fictionalizes a specific event that happened in the 1990s, and that event is when a US senator apparently crashed a car into a lake. The senator lives, but he inadvertently causes the death of the passenger in the car, which is a young woman. And this story kind of fictionalizes this woman's life as well as her last moments in the car. This is an incredibly dark and bleak book, and I just love the writing in this. It is told with a fragmented narrative. It jumps between this woman's last moments in the car as well as her childhood, and also when she first meets the senator, when she becomes enamored with him and is seemingly about to embark on an affair with him. I just think this author writes in incredibly poetic and vivid ways. Her descriptions of this woman's final moments when she is like inhaling brackish water are incredibly memorable to me. I thought the story overall was emotionally affecting, and I would just say this is like the perfect concentrated dose of dark and depressing that just really hit all the right notes for me. The Adversary by Michael Crummy. This is historical lit fic. It is set in like the 1800s, I think. At its center, it's about a sibling rivalry between a wealthy sister and brother who are kind of like powerhouses in this like small town where they own a bunch of land and businesses. And the entire story is about the lengths to which they will go to like destroy each other. And a lot of the townspeople kind of get swept up in this rivalry. It's kind of one of those allegorical tales about the evils of greed and obsession. This is one where I really enjoyed the writing style. I think it's incredibly lyrical and immersive, but also has like an edge to it. I thought there was some great range and subtlety in the character work. I love some of the character arcs, and overall I just found this to be a really gripping story. Tampa by Alyssa Nutting. This is one of the raunchiest and most vile books I've ever read. It is about a really attractive young woman who is a high school teacher and also happens to be a pedophile, and the entire book is her setting out to groom a high school student of hers. I guess this is considered like pretty dark and edgy comedy because this is basically about a woman who is so pretty that she basically will get away with almost anything, including sexually grooming a child. But yeah, I just thought this was absolutely hilarious. The writing I also thought was brilliant. It is so creative and decadent and really fitting with the tone. This ended up feeling like a tad long for what it is, but overall I really loved it. Bunny by Mona Awad. I don't think this book needs much of an introduction. It is a TikTok sensation, and I do have a soft spot for it because it is my official introduction to weird girl lit fic. It's just a highly entertaining book to me. It's satirical, it's edgy, but it also had emotional moments for me. I thought it was a great balance of like batshit unhinged stuff happening, also funny moments, also a plot, and then a character that I ended up sympathizing with. I will also say some of these social dynamics depicted in this book between the girls I thought were done really well. The writing was overall on point to me, and yeah, all that stuff together makes for a great read to me. A Town Like Alice by Neville Shute. This is a historical novel that was published in the 50s. The first half takes place during World War II, and it's kind of like a harrowing survival story. The protagonist ends up getting taken as a prisoner of war by the Japanese, but then the second half becomes like a cozy Legends and Lattes situation with the main character like trying to set up a business in like the Australian outback. Some of the language is definitely outdated, but overall I really loved the story. The setting I thought was transportive and sweeping. I thought the heroine was a badass. It features one of my favorite love stories of all time. The emotional moments worked for me, and yeah, overall just a good old-fashioned old-fashioned yarn, The Vegetarian by Han Kang. This is the first book I've read by this author, who happened to win the Nobel Prize in Literature this year. This book was originally published in Korean. I think this book is one of her earlier works, but one of her most well-known. It is about a woman who one day, seemingly out of the blue, decides to become a vegetarian, and everyone in her life just can't handle this, but also her diet becomes more and more extreme to the point where she just eats nothing and wants to like photosynthesize. It tackles a lot of feminist themes and societal issues and is packaged as like surreal body horror with like a ton of disturbing content. I did enjoy the writing, and there is dark humor in this as well. Like every single male character in this book is like the biggest piece of shit that you'll ever read about. I think there's a lot that you can unpack in the story. It was eerie and unsettling to me, and overall I just found it to be a really engaging read. Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jadrowski. This is queer historical lit fic. It is about the fleeting first love between two university students in Poland in the 80s. You can tell it takes a lot of inspiration from Giovanni's Room, which I also loved. I just thought this was a really arresting and evocative story. I thought the author's writing did justice to the time period, and overall I really connected to the way he writes human connection and emotion. I think there's real attention paid to render the really small intimacies within human interactions, and overall I just thought this was a really effective and moving story. The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin. This is a sci-fi thriller, and it's probably the book that had me on the edge of my seat the most in this list. It is about a young couple that moves into a new neighborhood, and the wife notices that all the other wives in the neighborhood are very weirdly obsessed with doing domestic household chores, and this ultimately belies a very sinister secret. There's phenomenal pacing and tension that is built throughout this book. There are tonal shifts to horror in this book that achieve Parasite movie level of elite to me. I just think this is freaking great. Can't recommend it enough. The Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante. This is the first book I've read by this author, who is incredibly respected, and it did not disappoint. The main character is a woman who is married and has 2 kids, and one day her husband just like up and leaves her. The book is about the emotional journey that she goes on after this event. She kind of just like loses her shit. This is probably one of my favorite depictions of female rage. She goes through a period of being so angry and vindictive and bitchy. I loved the climactic scene of her like throwing a fit when she accidentally locks herself in the house. The writing I found to be very emotional and gut-wrenching, and overall I just thought this was fantastic. Erasure by Percival Everett. First book I read from this author, who I think is like kind of having his moment with the release of James, but he actually has like a really long backlist. He's been writing for a long time. This is one of his earlier published works. It is a piece of satirical metafiction. It was also recently adapted into the movie called American Fiction, and yeah, this is an S tier book for me. Most of it is on the grounds of it being gut-bustingly funny. I've seriously never laughed as hard as I have reading a book. The premise is about this professor who writes like really pretentious and academic literature, and he just can't sell books for the life of him because nobody wants to read that. His agent is like constantly pressuring him to write about like the Black experience instead to sell books, and he sees the success that a contemporary of his has from writing like really overwrought fiction about Black people living in poverty, and so he is just like fed up and decides to write a joke of a book that is a parody of the really gritty depictions of Black people living in the ghetto. He sends his book to the publishers, and it is taken seriously and hailed as like a literary masterpiece. This has like a book within a book structure because we actually get to read the full novel that this character writes, which is titled My Pathology, and it is just so absurdly funny to me. I think there's a ton of biting and insightful commentary on our culture that is still really relevant today, even though this came out in like 2001. And yeah, he tackles a lot between like the publishing industry, race, identity, authenticity, and honestly, there's probably like a ton of subtext that I missed, but overall, highly recommend. I think this is brilliantly done satire. My favorite book that I've read on this list is The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry. I would describe this as a wacky literary western with a love story at its center. The book starts off in a town in Montana, and you're following the main character named Tom Rourke. And right off the bat, you get the sense that this man is a good-for-nothing loafer. He owes a bunch of different money to people. He is a gambler and a drug addict. He also has this like tortured poet shtick going on. One day he meets a woman named Polly, who is basically a mail order bride for someone else in town, so right off the bat she is taken. But despite that, there's an instant connection between Polly and Tom, and decide to run away to San Francisco together. But not before Tom steals a bunch of money from his landlady and burns down his boarding house. And the story basically follows their journey as they try to Bonnie and Clyde their way to San Francisco. There's a pretty colorful cast of other characters as well. Like Polly's husband is like this God-fearing man with certain proclivities. There's a couple of bounty hunters that are on their tails. And overall, I just found this to be an incredibly entertaining and fun story. Also, when it comes to the writing, it is definitely heavily stylized. Like you can tell this man is really trying with the prose. It's metaphorical. There are some like out of place sounding adjectives and adverbs that are used, and sometimes it gives me the sense that the author could just care fuck all about making sense. But honestly, once I settled into the story, I ended up really liking the writing. I thought it conveyed a wide range of emotions in a rich way, and I thought the author manages to strike a really nice balance between grimness, humor, and vulgarity while also hitting the right romantic notes. And yeah, I thought the writing overall was really fitting for this kind of offbeat story. There's so many hilarious aspects to the story, between Tom Rourke being this like Don Quixote-esque character who makes like a grand show of himself, but he's actually just like dumb as shit, and all the other characters who come in contact with him can't help but comment on his like utter ineptitude. There's a scene where Polly and Tom have like barely set off on their trip, and Polly's just like, this man has like zero clue what cardinal direction we're even traveling in right now. There's also a scene in this that is the equivalent of the cactus juice scene from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Also, this author somehow manages to throw in a training montage sequence. Like, I literally laughed out loud at the sheer ridiculousness of the direction this plot had to go in to get there. I don't think this writing style and humor will be for everyone, but I honestly loved it. I will also say that the author can be a total tease and will literally jerk you right out of the action in the most consequential moments with a POV switch. I can imagine that being annoying for a lot of people. He basically pulls this exact move at the very end of the book, and honestly, I can respect that. I really loved how the story came together. All right, well, I've talked through 66 books. I will probably go back and retroactively add tiers to this. I'll probably just do like A through F tiers. Bye.